"This is my rent money," he told me with a grin. 2 hours later, he couldn't even afford the cab ride home. "My name is Sarah. I'm a blackjack dealer who thought I understood the game better than the players. For 3 years, I watched people lose everything while I stayed safe behind the table. I had rules. I had control. I had $63 in tips and a transmission that was dying. Then I sat down on the other side. Just once, I told myself, just to see what it felt like. The cards felt different in my hands. Winning felt like proof I was smarter than everyone else. Losing felt like a mistake I could fix with one more hand. Weeks blurred together. Credit cards maxed out. Rent notices piled up. I kept telling myself I was different, that I knew the math, that I could stop anytime. I was wrong about everything. The safe side of the table disappeared the moment I chose to cross it. When someone who deals cards for a living can't stop playing them, what does that say about the game, or about the person holding them? I counted my tips from the night before while sitting in my Honda Civic, $63 for 8 hours of dealing blackjack. Barely enough for gas to get me through the week. The grinding noise from my transmission had gotten worse, but I couldn't afford to think about that now. Inside the Riverside Casino, Friday night was picking up its familiar rhythm. I tied my dealer's apron and took my position at table 7. Running through the mental checklist I'd perfected over 3 years. Fresh deck, clean felt, enough chips in the tray. The regulars would start filtering in soon. Faces I knew by their betting patterns and tells. Marcus Rivera slid into seat 3. Around 9 p.m. with that grin I'd come to recognize. Half confidence, half desperation wrapped in construction worker swagger. He pulled out 8 crisp $100 bills and spread them across the felt like he was laying out blueprints. "This is my rent money," he announced to the table, loud enough for the other players to hear. His calloused hands smoothed the bills. With genuine excitement, like he was sharing good news instead of confessing financial recklessness, I'd heard variations of this line hundreds of times. Players always felt compelled to explain what they were risking: rent money, car payments, their kids' college fund. Usually, it was their way of convincing themselves they'd quit when they got ahead. Marcus said it differently, though, like, the danger itself was part of the thrill. Changing 800. I called to the pit boss, my voice carrying the professional neutrality I'd mastered. The other players, a retiree with careful $5 bets and a nervous businessman clutching his credit card, shifted in their seats. You could feel the energy change when someone brought serious money to a table. Marcus placed a $100 chip on his betting circle. "Let's see what Friday night's got for me." The first few hands went his way. Natural blackjack on the second. "Deal," he hooped and tipped me a green chip. His stack grew to over $1,000 within 30 minutes. He was loose with tips, buying drinks for the table, making jokes about his system for reading dealers' whole cards that I dealt the cards with practiced efficiency, watching him make decisions that started smart and gradually became more aggressive. That's how it always went. Early wins convinced players they'd figured something out, some pattern or edge that made them different from everyone else who'd sat in that same seat. "You know what I like about you, Sarah?" Marcus said, reading my name tag. "You don't judge. Some dealers, they get this look when they see what's coming. You just deal." He was wrong about that. I was judging, calculating exactly how this would. And based on 3 years of watching people convince themselves they could beat mathematics. But he was right about one thing. I kept dealing. Marcus signaled for another card on a soft 17, and I knew this was where things usually started to go wrong. The next hour unfolded like a slow-motion car accident I'd seen dozens of times before. Marcus doubled down on 11 against my 10, a textbook play that happened to work, bringing his stack up to 1,500. The win made him bold. "See that?" he said to the businessman beside him. "You've got to play to win, not just to survive." His confidence grew with each successful hand. He started making side bets, wagering on whether his first 2 cards would be suited, whether he'd get a pair. The side bets had terrible odds, house edges of 20% or more, but Marcus was feeling invincible. I dealt him 2 eights against my 7. Basic strategy called for splitting, but not with the aggressive betting he'd been doing. He split anyway, putting another 100 on the second hand. Both hands needed help. The first 8 caught a 3. 11 total. He doubled down again, for $100 now riding on cards that hadn't fallen yet. The double down card was a 6. 17 against my 7. Not terrible, but not the 21 he needed to feel secure. The second 8 caught a 9. 17 again. He stood pat, but I could see the mathematics starting to weigh on him. $800 on two mediocre hands while I still had a card to draw. My whole card was a king. 17 for the house. Push on both hands. Marcus got his money back, but the near miss rattled him. The invincible feeling was cracking. Dealer got lucky there, he muttered, but we both knew luck had nothing to do with it. The bad run started with 3 losing hands in a row. Not dramatic losses, just steady erosion that turned his stack of hundreds into mostly 20s and 10s. I watched him start doing the mental math I'd seen countless times. How much he could afford to lose, how much he needed to win back, whether his next paycheck could cover the shortfall. The businessman left after losing $50, shaking his head. The retiree colored up his small winnings and wished Marcus luck. Now it was just him against the house, his stack down to maybe $400. You ever seen anyone come back from this deep? Marcus asked me, trying to keep his voice casual. The honest answer was yes. I'd seen miraculous comebacks that kept people gambling for years, chasing that one perfect night. But I'd seen the other ending far more often. Anything can happen, I said, which was true enough and meaningless enough to keep me out of trouble with my supervisor. Marcus was down to his last 200 when he asked the question, and I could hear the desperation creeping into his voice. Underneath the forced optimism, Marcus's final descent happened faster than I expected. He split his 8s against my 7, a reasonable play that turned catastrophic when both hands busted. First 8 caught a 5, then a king. 23. The second 8 caught a 6, then another king. 24. Both hands dead. $400 gone in 30 seconds. He sat in stunned silence for what felt like minutes, but was probably only 30 seconds. The casino's ambient noise, slot machines, distant laughter, the shuffle of cards, continued around us. But our table had become a pocket of shocked quiet. Well, Marcus finally said, his voice hollow. That's that. He had no chips left, just the empty betting circle in front of him and his work shirt with the construction company logo. I continued dealing to the empty seats out of habit, following protocol even though we both knew the session was over. Marcus looked around the table like he was trying to remember how he'd gotten there. Then he turned to the elderly man who'd taken the businessman's seat. Hey, buddy, could you spot me 20 for a cab? I'll get it back to you next week. The man looked uncomfortable, glanced at his own modest stack of chips. Sorry, I don't really know you. Marcus tried the woman at first base, then a young guy who'd just sat down. Each decline made him smaller somehow, the confidence evaporating with each no, until he was just a guy who'd made a terrible mistake and couldn't afford to get home. Finally, the elderly man took pity and offered $10. For the cab, he said quietly. Marcus accepted the bill with the kind of forced gratitude that made everyone at the table look away. As he stood to leave, he caught my eye. You know what the difference is between me and you, he said, not angry, but with strange clarity. You're on the safe side of this table. Security guard Tom Rodriguez appeared as Marcus walked toward the exit, not escorting him out, but making sure he was okay. I heard Tom ask if he needed help calling someone or getting home safely. Marcus waved him off, but I could see Tom watching until he disappeared through the casino's main entrance. That I dealt cards to the remaining players for another hour, but Marcus's words stayed with me. The safe side of the table. I'd never thought of my job that way before, as being safe from something rather than just doing something. But he was right. Every night, I watched people risk money they couldn't afford to lose while I collected my steady paycheck and tips. My shift ended at 2 a.m., but Marcus's words followed me to the parking lot. I counted my tips in the car, $63 for 8 hours, same as always. The grinding noise started when I turned the key, and I made a mental note to call the mechanic tomorrow, even though I knew I couldn't afford whatever he'd tell me. The drive home took me past 3 different ATMs, and I found myself glancing at each one, thinking about Marcus standing there with his card declined. How do you explain that to yourself? How do you go from having rent money to asking strangers for cab fare in the span of 2 hours? My studio apartment looked exactly like what $63 a night could afford, clean but sparse, with furniture from Goodwill and a mattress on the floor. The final rent notice was taped to my door, bright yellow paper that might as well have been neon. Third and final notice, in bold letters across the top, that I sat on my couch and did the math. I'd been avoiding 12 days behind on rent. $450 owed immediately, another $450 due in 3 weeks. My checking account had $127. The transmission repair would cost at least $800, according to the estimate sitting on my kitchen counter. My phone showed 3 missed calls from my mother. I'd been putting off calling her back because I knew what she wanted to discuss: the medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover, the treatments she needed but couldn't afford. She tried to sound casual about it, but I could always hear the worry underneath. That I lay in bed thinking about Marcus's comment and doing different math in my head. How much money had flowed across my table that night? Maybe $4,000 in total action. The house edge on blackjack was around 0.5% with perfect play, higher with the mistakes most players made. I facilitated wealth transfer every single night, money moving from players' pockets to the casino's coffers, while I struggled to pay for groceries. The contrast felt sharper now than it ever had before. I was professionally competent at a job that required understanding probability and human psychology, but personally, I was drowning in debt that grew faster than my income. I helped run a machine designed to extract money from people, while I couldn't extract myself from financial problems that seemed trivial compared to the sums I dealt with every night. That I fell asleep wondering where Marcus was sleeping and whether he'd learned something that would keep him away, or if this was just another Friday night in a cycle that would repeat next week. The next morning, my car made a new grinding noise when I started it. The mechanic's diagnosis was worse than I'd feared. "Transmission's shot," Tony said, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "800 minimum, probably closer to 1,000 once we get into it." I stared at the Honda Civic on his lift, its undercarriage exposed like a patient on an operating table. $1,000 might as well have been 10,000. "How long can I drive it like this?" I asked. "Maybe a week, maybe a month. Hard to say. But when it goes completely." My mother called while I was walking back to catch the bus to work. "Sarah, honey, I hate to bother you, but..." The pause told me everything. The insurance denied the claim for the new medication. It's $300 a week, and I'm thinking maybe I could skip it for a while. Skip medication that kept her functioning because insurance companies had shareholders to please. I wanted to tell her I'd cover it, wanted to be the daughter who could solve her mother's problems, but I had $127 in checking and owed more than I made in 2 months. "Don't skip anything, Mom. I'll figure something out." Another lie to add to the collection. I picked up every available overtime shift that week, working doubles until my feet ached and my voice went hoarse from calling cards. 60 hours of dealing blackjack, watching money change hands while mine stayed static. After taxes and expenses, I ended the week exactly where I'd started financially. During my dinner break Wednesday, I found myself watching the employee poker game in the break room. Dave from security was dealing 5-card stud, quarters and $half scattered across the table. Nothing serious, just guys blowing off steam after their shifts. "You ever play, Sarah?" Dave asked, shuffling the deck with practiced ease. "Not really. It's different when you're holding the cards instead of dealing them. Want to watch a hand?" I pulled up a chair. The stakes were small, $5 ante, $10 maximum bet, but I found myself calculating odds the way I did at my blackjack table. Dave caught a pair of kings showing and bet aggressively. Miguel from maintenance folded with what looked like a decent hand. The psychology was identical to what I observed every night, just with smaller numbers. Dave won with 3 kings and tipped the dealer, himself, a dollar chip as a joke. $23 profit in one hand. Friday night arrived, and Marcus's usual seat at my table remained empty. Working another Friday night without Marcus felt strange, like a routine had been broken. I kept glancing at seat 3, half expecting him to walk up with another stack of hundreds and that familiar grin. But the chair stayed empty, and I dealt to different players with smaller bankrolls and more conservative strategies. During my dinner break, I wandered over to the employee poker table. Dave waved me over. Perfect timing. Jimmy just busted out. "I don't really know how to play. 5-card stud, nothing wild. You're a dealer, you'll pick it up fast." I sat down with $20, telling myself it was just social, a way to understand what players experienced on the other side. The first hand, I folded early with nothing. The second, I caught a pair of queens on the deal and stayed in. The betting was light. $1 here, $2 there. When the final cards came down, my queens held up against Dave's jacks and a scattered collection of nothing hands. I won $8. The rush was different from anything I'd experienced dealing. Personal. Immediate. When I won, the money was mine. When others lost, I'd taken it from them through skill and luck combined. No wonder players got hooked. This felt like earning something rather than just receiving a paycheck. Beginner's luck, Dave said, but he was smiling. Plus dealer's advantage. You can read tells. I played 3 more hands, won 2, lost 1, and walked away $30 ahead. The smart play, the controlled play. But walking back to my table, I couldn't stop thinking about those moments when the cards fell my way, when the psychology I understood professionally worked in my favor personally. My shift ended at 2 a.m. Instead of heading straight to the parking lot, I found myself walking through the main casino floor, past the slot machines and roulette tables. I stopped at the edge of the blackjack pit and looked at my empty table from a player's perspective, seat 3, where Marcus used to sit, faced the dealer's position where I spent 40 hours a week. From this angle, I could see what players saw: the green felt, the chip tray, the cards that determined their fate. The safe side of the table, Marcus had called my position. But standing here, holding $30 in poker winnings, safe, felt less like security and more like limitation. Over the next few weeks, my curiosity about playing grew into something resembling a plan. I started staying after my shifts to play a few hands at other dealers' tables, telling myself it was research, understanding the player experience to become a better dealer, and I kept detailed mental notes. Jennifer from the day shift seemed to run cold. Players at her table lost more often than statistical probability suggested. Mike from swing shift had the opposite problem, players getting lucky against him with disturbing frequency. Superstition, probably, but I cataloged the patterns anyway. During breaks, I studied basic strategy charts in the dealer's lounge, memorizing the mathematically correct play for every possible hand combination. Hit 16 against the dealers. 7. Double down on 11 against anything except an ace. Split aces and eights. Never split tens. My initial sessions were conservative. $25 hands. Perfect basic strategy, careful bankroll management. And I won more than I lost. Not dramatically, but consistently enough to build confidence that I could approach gambling differently than recreational players like Marcus. "You're getting good at this," said the dealer at table 12 after I'd won 3 hands in a row. "Just following the book," I replied, but internally I was calculating. $80 profit in 90 minutes. More than I made in tips most nights. The success fed a dangerous logic. If I could win consistently at low stakes, why not higher stakes? If I understood the mathematics better than typical players, didn't I have an edge beyond basic strategy? I started postponing the car repair, convincing myself I could win the money faster than I could save it. The employee poker games became a regular stop. I was developing a reputation as tight but aggressive, someone who folded bad hands quickly but bet strongly when I had something. Dave started calling me the professional, as a joke that felt increasingly accurate. "Most people gamble with their hearts," he said one night after I'd won a particularly large pot. "You gamble with your head. Big difference." He was right, but he was also wrong. I was gambling with my head, but my heart was getting involved too. Each win felt like validation, proof that I'd figured something out that other people missed. Each loss was just variance, temporary bad luck in a game I understood better than most. My landlord called while I was counting winnings from the night before. $140 spread across my kitchen table in 5s, 10s, and 20s. "Sarah, we need to talk about the rent. You're 48 hours away from eviction proceedings," Frank said, his voice tired rather than angry. He'd been patient, more patient than most landlords would be, but patience had limits. That I stared at the money on my kitchen table, 140 in gambling winnings that should have gone to rent weeks ago. "I can get it to you by Monday." "That's what you said last Monday. And the Monday before that." The math was simple and brutal. I owed $800 immediately, another $450 in 3 weeks. My checking account had grown to $200 thanks to careful spending, but that wasn't close to enough. The transmission estimate sat next to my coffee cup like a second mortgage payment, but I'd also been winning. 300 net positive over 2 weeks of careful play. The logic felt sound. Instead of needing to save for months, I could potentially win my rent money in one good session. "Friday," I told Frank. "I'll have it Friday." Another lie, but this one felt different. This one had a plan behind it. Friday night, I finished my shift and walked directly to table 12 where Mike was dealing. Mike, who ran hot for players, whose table had become my most profitable hunting ground. I sat down with $400. Money from 2 credit card cash advances combined with my gambling profits. My first significant wager, $100 on a single hand. The money I actually needed rather than money I could afford to lose. The cards came down, Queen and Jack. Blackjack. 150 back, 50 profit in 30 seconds. The win felt like confirmation. I bet 200 on the next hand, King and Ace. Another blackjack. 300 back, 100 more profit. In 2 hands, I'd made more than I typically earned in tips for an entire night that I should have left. Should have taken the 200 profit and applied it to rent, played smaller stakes, managed my bankroll like the professional I claimed to be. Instead, I increased my next bet to 250, convinced this proved my system worked. The cards were telling me something, and I was finally smart enough to listen. I left the session up $400, but still owing twice that in rent. I called Frank and lied about when the money would arrive, buying myself 3 more days to turn 400 into 800. The plan was taking shape. The 3 extra days I'd bought from Frank felt like a countdown timer in my head. 72 hours to turn $400 into 800 or face eviction proceedings that would destroy what little credit I had left. The pressure should have made me cautious, but instead it made me bold. I took my first credit card cash advance Tuesday morning. $500 at 29% interest that I told myself was short-term financing for gambling capital. The logic seemed sound. If I could consistently win at low stakes, higher stakes just meant faster profits. Mathematics didn't care about the source of the money. The employee poker game had become my regular warm-up. $5 ante felt like Monopoly money now, but it kept my skills sharp and my confidence high. Dave dealt me pocket kings, and I played them aggressively, building a $40 pot that I took down when the board came queen high. "You're getting dangerous," Miguel said, folding what looked like a decent hand to my river bet. "Just playing the odds," I replied, but the truth was more complex. I was playing the odds, but I was also playing the people. 3 years of watching gamblers had taught me to read micro-expressions, to spot tells that revealed strength or weakness. The skills transferred perfectly to poker. Thursday night, I finished my shift and headed straight to table 15. Jessica was dealing. New hire, nervous, the kind of dealer who made small mistakes that observant players could exploit. I sat down with $600, my largest session yet. The first 40 minutes went perfectly. Basic strategy, careful. Bet sizing, steady accumulation. I was up nearly 200 when the cards turned cold. 3 losing hands in a row, then 4, then 5. My 600 became 400, then 300, then 2. The loss felt personal in a way dealing never had. When players lost at my table, it was just mathematics expressing itself. When I lost, it was money I needed, opportunities disappearing with each bad card. I felt physically sick walking to my car, down $300 of money I couldn't afford to lose, but I also felt something else, determination. This wasn't the end of my story, just a temporary setback. I returned the next night with larger bets, convinced I could recover quickly. $700 this time. Another credit card advance combined with my remaining gambling funds. I played aggressively from the start, doubling down on marginal hands, betting big when I had the slightest edge. The variance that had hurt me Thursday worked in my favor Friday. I won back the 300 plus another 200, leaving the casino up 500 for the week. The victory felt like vindication. I'd proven that short-term losses were just noise in a longer-term winning strategy. I had the skills, the knowledge, and the discipline to beat games that destroyed recreational players. My mother called while I was playing Saturday, but I let it go to voicemail to focus on my cards. The voicemail was 6 minutes long, which told me everything before I even listened. Mom only left long messages when something was seriously wrong, and she was trying to convince herself it wasn't. "Hi, honey. I hope work is going well. I had a little scare yesterday. Ended up spending some time at the hospital. Nothing serious. Just some chest pains that turned out to be anxiety related to, well, everything. The bills from the ER visit will be substantial, but don't you worry about that. I've been managing my medications carefully, and I think maybe I can stretch them a little further. 6 hours in the emergency room. Alone. While I was playing cards, and congratulating myself on my mathematical sophistication that I called her back immediately. Mom, why didn't you call me from the hospital? You were working, sweetie. And it really wasn't that serious. Just stress manifesting physically. Stress about medical bills she couldn't afford. Stress about skipping medications to save money. Stress that had literally put her in the emergency room while I was calculating pot odds and reading tells at poker tables. I should have been there. You have your own life to live. Besides, what could you have done? It's not like you have medical training. What I could have done was pay for her treatments. My gambling wins over the past month, if I'd sent them to her instead of reinvesting them, could have covered several weeks of medication. Instead, I'd been chasing bigger scores while she'd been rationing pills. This created a new layer of pressure beyond rent and car repairs. My mother needed help, real help, not just moral support over the phone. The mathematics changed. I wasn't just trying to win $800 for rent, but potentially thousands for her ongoing care that I spent my lunch break researching other casino games. Blackjack had house edges around 0.5% with perfect play, but Baccarat was similar with less skill required. Pai Gow poker had even lower variance, though the wins came more slowly. Craps offered legitimate zero-edge bets if you knew how to play them. You thinking about branching out? Dave asked, noticing the strategy guides I was reading. Just curious about the math on different games. Pai Gow's good for grinding. Lower variance than blackjack, longer sessions. Some guys make decent side money there. Side money. That's what this still felt like in my head, supplemental income rather than gambling. I was using my professional knowledge to generate additional revenue streams. The fact that those streams happened to involve cards and chips didn't change the fundamental logic that I calculated what a big win could accomplish. $2,000 would cover my rent for 4 months and my mother's medication for 6 weeks. $3,000 would fix my car and still leave money for her treatments. $5,000 would solve every immediate problem and give me a buffer to play. More conservatively going forward, the numbers made sense. I just needed one good session to set everything right. I requested my first personal day in 3 years, telling Janet I had family obligations to handle. I arrived at the casino Tuesday afternoon with $1,200, the largest amount I'd ever brought to a gaming table. Multiple credit card advances, my gambling profits, and money I'd scraped together from selling textbooks and jewelry my grandmother had left me. Everything liquid I could access without losing my apartment immediately. The plan was simple. Start at blackjack, move to baccarat if I fell behind, switch to Pai Gow if I needed to grind back slowly. I knew the optimal strategies for all 3 games and had observed enough sessions to identify the dealers who ran hot or cold for players. Table 8 had Michael dealing. One of the veterans who'd been there longer than me, steady hands, predictable rhythm. I bought in for the full $1,200 and started with $50 hands. Conservative by my recent standards, but still 10 times what I'd bet just a month ago. The first hour went according to plan. Basic strategy, careful bankroll management, steady accumulation. I was up nearly $400 when a businessman in an expensive suit sat down and started betting black chips, hundreds on every hand. His presence changed the energy at the table, and suddenly my $50 bets felt small. You can't win big betting small, he said after winning a $1,000 hand. The house edge is the same whether you bet 50 or 500. He was mathematically correct, but psychologically dangerous. I increased my bets to match his energy, 100, then 150, then 200 per hand. The cards cooperated initially. I doubled down on 11 and caught a 10, split 8s, and made 2 strong hands. My stack grew to nearly 2,000. Then the businessman busted out spectacularly. 5 losing hands in a row, 1,500 gone in 10 minutes. He left muttering about loaded decks and bad luck, but the damage was done. His reckless energy had infected my careful strategy that I should have returned to $50 hands. Should have locked up my profits and played conservatively with house money. Instead, I convinced myself that his bad run meant the cards were due to turn favorable again. Gambler's fallacy in its purest form, a logical error I would have ridiculed. In any player at my own table, the descent accelerated. I switched to baccarat when blackjack turned cold, chasing the businessman's theory that different games ran in different cycles. When baccarat failed, I moved to Pai Gow, betting large on a game designed for slow, steady action. Nothing worked. Every strategic adjustment I made seemed to trigger exactly the opposite result. The cards that had felt friendly for weeks suddenly turned malicious. By 6 p.m., my 1200 had become 800. By 8 p.m., it was 400. By 10 p.m., I was betting hand-to-hand with money I needed for basic survival. My final bet was everything I had left, $273 on a baccarat hand that should have been a winner. Banker had 8, player had 7. Simple, clean, mathematical. Then the player drew a 3 for a natural 10, and my last chips disappeared into the dealer's rack that I sat in the casino parking lot as the sun came up, unable to afford gas to get home. The tap on my car window came with the dawn light, gentle but insistent. I looked up to see Tom Rodriguez in his security uniform, his expression concerned rather than suspicious. "Sarah, you okay?" The question was professional courtesy, but Tom's eyes told me he knew exactly what had happened. He'd probably watched my entire 8-hour session on the security monitors, seen the careful strategy dissolve into desperate betting, witnessed the final hand that wiped out everything I'd brought. "Just tired," I said, but my voice cracked on the words. "Long session." He wasn't judging, just acknowledging reality. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Tom had worked casino security for 15 years. He'd seen this scene played out hundreds of times. The car that wouldn't start because the owner couldn't afford gas. The player who'd stayed until they had nothing left. The moment when someone crossed from recreational gambling to something darker. "You need a few bucks for gas?" he asked quietly, already reaching for his wallet. The kindness from a colleague while I sat in the same position as Marcus devastated me more than the financial losses. Tom pulled out a 20 and handed it through the window without ceremony, without making me ask or explain or promise to pay it back. "Thanks," I whispered, accepting the money with hands that shook slightly from exhaustion and adrenaline crash. "Get some sleep," Tom said. "Things always look different after sleep." I drove home on his $20, the grinding transmission. Noise now accompanied by a new rattling that suggested even more expensive problems ahead. The eviction notice was taped to my apartment door. Official papers with court dates and legal language that made my situation real in ways that Frank's phone calls hadn't. That I sat on my couch understanding that everything had changed. I was no longer the dealer watching players self-destruct. I'd become the player, complete with the car window conversation with security and the inability to afford basic transportation. The safe side of the table was behind me now, and I couldn't see a way back. My phone rang with a call from Janet about my next scheduled shift. I stared at the phone, knowing I'd have to face her eventually, knowing I'd have to deal cards to people making the same mistakes I'd just made, knowing that every loss I facilitated would remind me of my own. But first, I had to figure out how to walk back into that building and pretend I was still the professional dealer rather than the desperate player who'd lost everything just hours before. The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. I let Janet's call go to voicemail, then immediately regretted it. Avoiding your supervisor when you're scheduled to work never ends well, but I couldn't face the conversation yet. Not while I was still sitting in the wreckage of my financial life, trying to process how completely I'd destroyed everything in one night. The voicemail was brief and professional. "Sarah, you're scheduled for day shift today. Call me when you get this." Day shift. I'd forgotten I'd switched to cover for someone. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was supposed to be dealing cards in 6 hours, facilitating the same kind of destruction I'd just experienced. The thought made my stomach turn. I called back and left my own message, trying to sound sick rather than desperate. "Janet, I'm really not feeling well. Might be food poisoning. I'll try to make my next shift." Even as I said it, I knew how unconvincing I sounded. 3 years of perfect attendance, and now I was calling in sick the day after my supervisor probably watched me lose $1,200 on security cameras. Casino management wasn't stupid. They monitored employee gambling more carefully than anyone else's. I spent the day trying to calculate my way out of disaster. For maxed credit cards with minimum payments that totaled more than I made in a week. 2 months rent owed, now with legal consequences attached. Car repairs that couldn't be postponed much longer without leaving me completely stranded. And my mother's medical bills, growing every week while I pretended I could help. The math was overwhelming. I owed more than I could make in 6 months of dealing, assuming I could keep my job and assuming I didn't spend money on anything else. Food, gas, basic necessities, all secondary to debt service. Now that I considered my options, writing them down on paper like a business plan, borrow from friends. But I'd isolated myself during my gambling weeks, declining invitations and avoiding social calls. Who could I ask for thousands of dollars? Ask for advances at work. Janet might authorize a few hundred against future shifts, but nothing approaching what I needed. Return to gambling to win back what I'd lost. The thought came automatically, even though I recognized it as the exact thinking pattern I'd observed in desperate players. That third option scared me because it didn't feel stupid. It felt logical. The casino was still the only place I knew where large amounts of money changed hands quickly. My skills hadn't disappeared overnight. I'd just experienced bad variance in a small sample size. With better bankroll management, more conservative betting, I caught myself planning my next session and realized this was exactly what Marcus had probably done after his devastating loss. This was how the cycle perpetuated itself. The desperate belief that gambling could solve problems gambling had created that my phone rang. Mom's number. I stared at it for 4 rings, then 5, then 6. How could I answer when I'd just guaranteed I couldn't help her with anything? How could I lie again about my situation when she needed honesty about what kind of support she could expect? But how could I not answer when she might be calling from another emergency room? On the 7th ring, I picked up. Hi, Mom. Sarah, sweetie, you sound terrible. Are you sick? Just tired. Work's been intense. I wanted to thank you for offering to help with the medical bills, but I've been thinking, and I don't want you to worry about that. I found a social worker who's helping me apply for assistance programs. There might be options I didn't know about. The relief in her voice was crushing. She'd found hope somewhere else because she couldn't depend on her daughter. The daughter, who'd been gambling away money that could have solved her problems while she was stretching medications and avoiding necessary treatments. That's great, Mom. But if you need anything, I know, honey. You're so good to worry about me. But you have your own life to build. Don't let my problems hold you back. After we hung up, I sat in my empty apartment realizing how completely our roles had reversed. She was protecting me from her problems while I was hiding my much worse problems from her. The person who'd raised me to be honest and responsible didn't know that her daughter had become exactly the kind of person she'd taught me not to be. The urge to return to the casino grew stronger as the day progressed. Not because I thought I could win, though part of me still believed that, but because staying in my apartment meant facing the full scope of what I'd done. At the casino, I could at least pretend I was taking action rather than just sitting with consequences. My phone rang again. Janet, this time. I had to answer eventually. Janet, I know I sound terrible, but I think I'm getting better, Sarah. Her voice was gentle but firm. We need to talk. Not about being sick. About last night. The words hung in the air between us. She knew. Of course she knew. Casino surveillance was designed to catch cheaters and count carders, but it also monitored employees. Janet had probably watched my entire session, seen the careful strategy deteriorate into desperation, witnessed the moment I lost everything. I can explain, not over the phone. Come in tomorrow at 2. We'll talk then. The line went dead. Janet wasn't angry, which somehow made it worse. Anger would have meant she thought I was worth fighting with. Her calm tone suggested she was already planning my termination paperwork. I tried calling my mother back, needing to confess everything before I lost the nerve, but she didn't answer. Probably at another medical appointment she couldn't afford, dealing with problems I should have been helping solve instead of creating new ones. The landline rang. An ancient thing I kept because it was cheaper than upgrading my cell plan. Frank's number on the caller ID. Sarah, I'm at your door with some papers that need your signature. Papers that need your signature. Legal language for eviction documents that would make my homelessness official. I buzzed him up, trying to think of something to say that might buy more time, but what was the point? I didn't have the money today, wouldn't have it tomorrow, and we both knew it. Frank looked genuinely sorry when I opened the door. He'd been a good landlord for 2 years, patient with late payments, understanding about my financial struggles. But understanding had limits, and I'd exceeded them. This is the formal notice, he said, handing me a manila envelope. You have 14 days to bring the account current or vacate the premises. After that, it becomes a legal matter. 14 days. 2 weeks to find 2 months' rent plus late fees plus court costs, or join the ranks of people who slept in their cars and showered at gyms. assuming my car lasted that long. Frank, I might have some money coming in, Sarah. He held up a hand, not unkindly. I've heard that 3 times now. I believe you mean it, but meaning it and making it happen are different things. I've got a mortgage on this building and tenants in the other units who pay on time. I can't carry you indefinitely. He was right, and we both knew it. I signed the papers acknowledging receipt of the notice, officially starting the countdown to homelessness. After Frank left, I opened the envelope and read through the legal documents. Court date set for 2 weeks from today. Total amount owed, $1,247, including late fees and court costs. The number felt simultaneously enormous and strangely small. Enormous because I didn't have it. Small because I'd seen individual hands of poker with bigger pots that I realized I was thinking about poker pot sizes and forced myself to stop. That kind of thinking, comparing real-world consequences to gambling stakes, was exactly how people lost everything. How I had lost everything. But I also realized something else. I needed to return to work. Not just for the money, though I desperately needed that. I needed to return because losing my job on top of everything else would make recovery impossible. No matter how humiliating it felt to deal cards after becoming exactly the kind of desperate player I'd served for 3 years. Unemployment would be worse that I set my alarm for early afternoon, giving myself enough time to shower and prepare for what might be my final conversation with Janet. If she was going to fire me, I at least wanted to face it professionally. The car made 3 different concerning noises when I started it the next day, but it got me to the casino parking lot. I sat there for 10 minutes, watching people walk in with hope and walk out with disappointment, seeing the cycle from both sides now. Finally, I walked inside to face whatever consequences were waiting. Janet's office was smaller than I'd expected. For someone who managed 40 dealers across 3 shifts. Photos of her daughter's soccer team covered one wall, a reminder that normal people had normal problems, tournament fees and equipment costs rather than eviction notices and maxed credit cards. Sit down, Sarah. She gestured to the chair across from her desk, then closed the door. The sound of that door clicking shut felt final, like a coffin lid or a jail cell. I've been dealing with problem gambling among employees for 12 years, she began, no preamble or small talk. I've seen dealers lose houses, marriages, custody of their kids. I've seen people who understood the mathematics better than anyone make the same mistakes as tourists who think the slots are due to hit. She opened a file folder, my employee record, probably, documenting 3 years of reliable performance that was about to be terminated. The thing that always surprises people is that we don't automatically fire dealers who gamble. We can't, legally, as long as it doesn't affect their work performance. But we do monitor it, and we do intervene when necessary. I waited for the but that would end my employment. Instead, Janet leaned forward. You lost $1,200. Tuesday night. You've been gambling regularly for approximately 6 weeks, with increasing frequency and stakes. Your attendance has become unreliable, 3 call-ins in the past month compared to 0 in the previous 3 years. Are you ready to talk about getting help? Getting help. Not getting fired, not getting suspended, but getting help. I hadn't expected compassion from casino management, especially not when their business model depended on people making exactly the kind of mistakes I'd made. My voice caught. I don't think I can stop on my own. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff. For weeks, I'd maintained the fiction that I was a skilled player making calculated decisions rather than a problem gambler chasing losses. Saying it out loud to my supervisor made it real in a way that losing the money hadn't. There's an employee assistance program, Janet said, pulling out a different folder. Counseling services, support groups, financial planning resources. You can access all of it confidentially, and your job is protected while you're getting treatment. Treatment. Like I had a disease rather than a character flaw. Like this was something that happened to people rather than something people chose to do. What about the money I lost? The debts. The program can help with financial counseling, but they can't undo what's already happened. You'll have to live with the consequences while you work on the underlying problem. Live with the consequences. Eviction, ruined credit, car repairs. I couldn't afford, mother's medical bills I couldn't help with. All the damage would remain while I attended meetings and worked on my gambling problem like it was a hobby that had gotten out of hand. Do I still have a job? Yes, but with conditions. You're banned from gambling on the premises, any game, any stake, including employee poker. You'll work day shifts only, which limits your access to the casino during peak hours. And you'll meet with the EAP counselor weekly for the first month. Day shifts meant smaller tips, but also less temptation. Fewer high roller tables, smaller pots in the employee poker games I couldn't join anyway. It felt like exile, but it also felt like a lifeline. When do I start back? Tomorrow, if you're ready. But Sarah. Janet paused, studying my face. This offer is one time only. If you gamble on the premises again, you're terminated immediately. If your attendance becomes unreliable again, you're terminated. This is your chance to get help before you lose everything. Don't waste it. I signed the paperwork acknowledging the conditions and scheduled my first counseling appointment. Walking out of Janet's office felt surreal. I still had a job, still had a chance to rebuild, but I also had restrictions that made my problem official. The casino floor looked different as I walked through it to the parking lot. The games I'd played with increasing desperation were still there, but I was banned from them now. Like a recovering alcoholic working in a bar, I'd have to deal cards to people making bets I couldn't make myself. An MY phone rang as I reached my car. Frank's number again. Sarah, I hate to bother you, but there's been a development. Someone broke into the apartment below yours last night. The police want to talk to all the tenants, and they noticed your eviction notice on file. They're asking whether you might have information about unusual activity in the building. Unusual activity. Like desperate people doing desperate things when they ran out of options. Like the kind of person I was becoming, the kind of person who might look at breaking and entering as just another way to solve financial problems. I'll come by tonight to talk to them, I said. Also, Sarah, I know things are difficult right now, but I need to ask, do you have anywhere else you can stay? The 14-day notice is still in effect, but given the security situation, I'd prefer if you could make other arrangements sooner. Other arrangements. Sleeping in my car, if it kept running that long. Imposing on friends I'd been avoiding. Moving back in with my mother and adding my problems to hers. I'll figure something out, I said. Another lie, but this one felt different. This one came with a plan to stop lying. Even if I hadn't figured out how yet, that I sat in the casino parking lot longer than necessary, watching the late afternoon shift change. Dealers heading home after 8 hours of facilitating other people's dreams and disasters. New dealers arriving to continue the cycle. In 12 hours, I'd be one of them again, back on the safe side of the table, but with the knowledge of what the other side felt like. A police cruiser pulled into the lot and parked near the main entrance. Probably routine. Casinos attracted all kinds of problems that required law enforcement, but I found myself wondering if they were there about the break-in at my building. Whether someone in my position had decided that taking money was easier than earning it. The thought scared me because it didn't seem entirely foreign. 6 weeks ago, I would have been horrified by the idea of stealing to pay debts. Now, sitting with maxed credit cards and an eviction notice, I understood how people reached that point. How normal moral boundaries became negotiable when survival was at stake, that I forced myself to drive away before those thoughts developed further. The apartment building looked different with police tape across the entrance to Unit 2B. 2 officers were interviewing Mrs. Chun from 2A, no relation, despite our shared surname, while a detective took photographs of the damaged door frame. Frank met me in the lobby. They broke in sometime between midnight and 6 a.m. Took some electronics, jewelry, cash from a hidden safe. Professional job, according to the detective. Did they get much? Few thousand in cash, plus whatever they could carry. Mrs. Chun was saving for her granddaughter's college fund. Kept it in cash because she didn't trust banks. The irony was crushing. An elderly woman's careful savings, accumulated over years of sacrifice, stolen by someone desperate enough to commit felonies. For money. Money I'd lost in a single night playing games I thought I understood. Detective Rodriguez, different Rodriguez from Tom at the casino, asked routine questions about unusual activity, suspicious characters, any changes in building security. I answered honestly. I'd been working nights, sleeping during the day, hadn't noticed anything unusual. What about your own situation? He asked, glancing at his notes. Mr. Kowalski mentioned you're facing eviction. The question hung in the air, professional but loaded. Was I desperate enough to steal from neighbors? Did my financial problems make me a suspect rather than just a witness? I'm behind on rent, I said carefully, but I'm working with my employer on a solution. True enough, though the solution involved admitting I had a gambling problem and accepting counseling rather than finding new sources of income. After the police left, Frank walked me to my door. Sarah, I know this timing is terrible, but the break-in changes things. Insurance requires enhanced security measures, which means new locks, cameras, additional costs. I need current tenants only, people whose rent I can count on. Current tenants only, people whose rent he could count on. I wasn't one of those people anymore, and we both knew it. How long do I have? Same 14 days, but I'd appreciate if you could expedite things. Other tenants are spooked about security and having an empty unit. He trailed off, not wanting to say that my impending eviction made the building look unstable. I understand. Inside my apartment, I made a list of everything I owned that had resale value. My grandmother's ring, maybe $200. A laptop 3 years old, $150. Books, clothes, furniture that came from Goodwill and would return there. Total liquidation value, maybe $500 toward debts that exceeded $10,000. That the mathematics were impossible. Even if I kept my job and worked every available shift, I couldn't earn money fast enough to stay ahead of interest and penalties. I was financially underwater with no way to surface, but I also had something I hadn't had that morning, a plan that didn't involve gambling. Counseling, support groups, financial planning resources. Help, even if it came too late to save my apartment. Or my credit.my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Feeling much better today? The social worker found a program that might cover most of my treatment costs. One less thing for you to worry about. One less thing for me to worry about. If only she knew that I'd created problems that dwarfed hers, that I was in no position to help anyone when I couldn't help myself. That I texted back. That's wonderful news. Love you. Then I called the EAP counselor to move up my appointment. If I was going to start telling the truth, I might as well start immediately. The counselor could see me tomorrow at 10 a.m. before my first shift back. 12 hours to prepare for 2 conversations I'd been avoiding. Admitting the scope of my problem to a professional, then dealing cards to people making the same mistakes I'd made. That I set my alarm and tried to sleep, but my mind kept calculating. 14 days until eviction. 12 hours until counseling. 8 months until my credit cards were paid off. Assuming I never missed a payment and never spent money on anything else. The numbers didn't add up to a solution, but they added up to a timeline. A schedule for facing consequences I'd created and figuring out how to rebuild from whatever was left. For the first time in weeks, I fell asleep without planning my next bet. The EAP counselor's office was in a medical building 10 minutes from the casino, neutral territory that didn't smell like cigarette smoke and desperation. Dr. Sarah Martinez, we shared a first name, which felt like either a good omen or a cosmic joke, had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the sort of calm presence that made confession feel possible. Tell me what brought you here, she said after the initial paperwork. I started with the facts. 3 years dealing blackjack, 6 weeks of escalating gambling, $1,200 lost in one session. Clean, clinical details that made my situation sound like a case study rather than a life in ruins. Those are the events, Dr. Martinez said. What about the feelings? What was happening emotionally when you decided to gamble for the first time? The question caught me off guard. I'd been focused on the mathematics, odds and bankroll management and strategic mistakes, but she wanted to talk about emotions. I felt competent, I said finally. Like I understood something other people didn't. I watched players make terrible decisions every night, and I thought I could do better. And did that feeling of competence change over time? It got stronger. When I won, proof that I was different, smarter. When I lost, it was just bad luck that I could overcome with better play. Right up until you lost everything. Right up until then. We spent an hour unpacking the progression. How financial pressure had made gambling look like a solution. How early wins had fed dangerous confidence. How each loss had created pressure for bigger wins to recover quickly. Dr. Martinez didn't judge or lecture. She just helped me see patterns I'd been too close to recognize. Gambling addiction often develops in people who are highly intelligent and analytical, she said near the end of our session. The same skills that make you good at your job, understanding probability, reading people, staying calm under pressure, can make you vulnerable to believing you can beat games designed to be unbeatable. So being smart made me stupid. Being smart made you overconfident. There's a difference, and understanding that difference is part of recovery. She gave me a meeting schedule for Gamblers Anonymous and a workbook about financial recovery. The money you lost is gone, she said. Recovery means accepting that while building tools to prevent future losses. It's not about getting even. It's about getting out of the hole and staying out. I drove from her office to the casino, switching mental gears from patient to dealer. The parking lot looked the same, but I felt different walking through it. Not cured. Dr. Martinez had been clear that one session wasn't a cure, but aware. Conscious of what I was walking back into, Janet met me at the employee entrance. How did it go? Eye-opening. Hard, but helpful. Good. You're on table 2-4. The day shift. Smaller limits, fewer players. Easier transition back. Table 2 was in the low roller section, where tourists played $5 and $10 hands and locals stretched small bankrolls across long sessions. Nothing like the high-stakes action I'd been chasing as a player, but perfect for someone relearning how to be just the dealer. My first player was a retiree named Harold, who bet $5 per hand and tracked his wins and losses on a spiral notebook. He was exactly the kind of careful, recreational player I'd been before everything went wrong. You're new here, he said, studying my face. New to day shift. I usually work nights. Nights are crazy. Too much money, too much drinking. Day shift is more civilized. Civilized. I dealt him cards for 2 hours, watching him win $30 and lose 25, finishing ahead by 5 and satisfied with his session. Civilized gambling by someone who understood it was entertainment with a cost rather than investment. With guaranteed returns. Around noon, Marcus walked past my table that I almost didn't recognize him at first. He'd lost weight, looked tired, but he was dressed for work and carrying a lunch cooler. Not the defeated figure who'd asked strangers for cab fare 6 weeks ago. He saw me at the same time and stopped. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the dealer who'd watched him lose everything and the player who'd provided my first glimpse of where gambling could lead. Sarah, right? He said finally. Right. How are you doing, Marcus? Better. Haven't been back here since. Well, since that night. Just cutting through to get to the construction site next door. That's good. That you haven't been back. He nodded toward my table. Day shift now. Yeah, change of pace. He understood what that meant without explanation. In casino culture, dealers moving from nights to days usually indicated problems, alcohol, drugs, or gambling issues that made them unsuitable for primetime shifts. Take care of yourself, he said, and continued walking. The brief interaction stayed with me for the rest of my shift. Marcus had found a way out, or at least a way to stay away. He'd had his bottom-out moment and somehow used it as a starting point rather than an excuse to dig deeper. After my shift, I drove to my apartment to pack. Frank had made it clear he needed me out sooner rather than later, and sleeping in my car was starting to look like the most realistic option. At least until I figured out what came next. The apartment felt different knowing I was leaving. Smaller, temporary, like a hotel room rather than home. I packed one suitcase with work clothes and essentials, left the rest for later. If I was going to be homeless, I'd be organized about it. My phone rang while I was folding clothes. My mother's number. Hi, Mom. Sarah, I have wonderful news. The assistance program came through. They'll cover 90% of my treatment costs. I can actually afford to get better now. The relief in her voice was overwhelming. After weeks of worry about money and medication, she'd found a solution that didn't depend on me. A solution I couldn't have provided anyway, given my current situation. That's incredible, Mom. I'm so happy for you. I wanted to thank you for offering to help, even though it wasn't necessary in the end. Just knowing you would have tried means everything. Knowing I would have tried. If only she knew that I'd not only failed to help her, I'd made helping impossible by gambling away money that could have covered her treatments. But she was getting help anyway, despite my failures rather than because of my efforts. I love you, I said, meaning it more than she could know. I love you too, sweetie. How are things with you? You sound different. Tired. Just work stuff. Nothing I can't handle. Another lie, but this one felt like protection rather than deception. She was finally getting the help she needed. No reason to burden her with problems she couldn't solve, and I created myself. After we hung up, I finished packing and loaded my car. The transmission made ominous noises, but it still moved. That would have to be enough for now. I drove to the casino parking lot. Not to gamble, but because it was well lit and secure, and I needed to think about what came next. Tomorrow I'd start looking for a room to rent, somewhere cheap enough that I could afford it on dealer wages while paying down debt. Tonight, though, I'd sleep in my car and try to process how completely my life had changed in 6 weeks that I reclined the driver's seat and closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I started to drift off, I'd think about the games happening inside the building 50 yards away. Not the urge to play. Dr. Martinez had been right about that first session. Helping, but awareness of what was happening at those tables. Money changing hands, hopes rising and falling. People convinced they'd figured out something that would change their lives. People like I'd been just days ago that I woke up with a security guard tapping on my window. Not Tom this time, but a younger guy I didn't recognize from the day's shift rotation. "Ma'am, you can't sleep in the parking lot. Casino policy." "I work here," I said, showing him my employee ID through the glass. He looked confused. Employees weren't supposed to be homeless, weren't supposed to need casino parking lots for shelter. But he also wasn't paid enough to make complex policy decisions at 6 in the morning. "I'll need to call this in," he said. "Don't. I'll move." I started the car, more concerning noises, but it ran, and drove to a 24-hour diner 3 blocks away. Coffee and breakfast, then figure out next steps. The waitress looked like she'd seen people sleeping in cars before and didn't judge. Small mercies. Over eggs and toast I couldn't really afford, I made a plan. First priority, find a room to rent, something basic but legal. Second priority, get my car fixed well enough to last until I could save for a replacement. Third priority, start the slow process of paying down debt while rebuilding my life. The plan felt impossible given my income versus expenses, but it also felt like the only alternative to giving up entirely. I spent the morning calling numbers from Craigslist ads. Rooms for rent in shared houses, efficiency apartments in questionable neighborhoods, spaces that rented by the week rather than month. The mathematics were brutal. Even the cheapest options cost more than I could afford while making minimum payments on my credit cards. Around noon, I found something that might work. A woman named Elena had a room in her house for $300 a month, utilities included. The catch: she only rented to people with verifiable employment and no history of evictions. "I don't run credit checks," she said over the phone, "but I do verify employment and call previous landlords. Can you provide references?" Frank would have to tell the truth about my eviction. I had verifiable employment, but I also had recent history of financial irresponsibility. Elena sounded like someone who'd been burned by tenants before and wasn't taking chances. "Can I see the room this afternoon?" I asked. "Sure." 2 o'clock. The house was in a neighborhood I didn't know, working class, but maintained, with small yards and cars that ran. Elena was maybe 45, wearing scrubs that suggested she worked in healthcare. "I'm a nurse at County General," she explained, showing me the room. "I work nights, so I need someone quiet during the day. No parties, no overnight guests without permission, rent due on the first with no exceptions." The room was small but clean, with a window that got afternoon light and space for a bed and dresser. Shared bathroom, shared kitchen, but it was legal housing with an address where I could receive mail. "I work at Riverside Casino," I said. "Day shift dealing, very stable schedule." She nodded approvingly. Casino workers are usually reliable. Good tips, steady income. If only she knew how unreliable this particular casino worker had been recently. But she was right about the potential for stability, assuming I could maintain it. "I'd need first month and security deposit," she said. $600 total. $600 I didn't have, for a room I desperately needed, from a woman who seemed reasonable but wouldn't tolerate the kind of financial chaos that had defined my recent life. "When would you need to make a decision?" I asked. "End of the week. I've got 2 other people interested, but you seem like you'd fit well here." I drove back to the casino for my afternoon shift, carrying everything I owned in one suitcase and trying to figure out how to come up with $600 without gambling. My first paycheck under the new arrangement wouldn't come for 2 weeks, and even then it wouldn't be enough to cover both rent deposit and my existing obligations. Table 2 was busier during the afternoon shift, but still manageable. Tourists. Mostly, people playing with money they could afford to lose for entertainment they could afford to buy. I dealt cards and made conversation, staying present in the job rather than calculating my financial problems. Around 4 o'clock, Tom Rodriguez stopped by my table during a lull between players. Heard you were back on days, he said casually. Yeah, better schedule for me right now. Good. Days are steadier, less drama. He paused, studying my face. You doing okay? You look tired. The concern in his voice reminded me of that morning in the parking lot when he'd given me gas money. Tom had seen my bottom moment and responded with kindness rather than judgment. Working through some things, I said. But yeah, I'm okay. If you need anything, and I mean anything, you let me know. We look out for each other here. After he left, I realized that we look out for each other might be more than just words. Tom had helped me when I was stranded. Janet had offered counseling instead of termination. Even Marcus, who had every reason to resent seeing me after his devastating loss, had been kind rather than bitter. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. My shift ended at midnight. Instead of driving to another parking lot to sleep in my car, I drove back to Elena's neighborhood and parked on her street. Not to bother her, but to imagine what it would feel like to have an address again, a legal place to exist while I rebuilt. The house was dark except for a porch light that suggested someone cared enough to make the entrance welcoming. A normal house where normal people dealt with normal problems, where landlords expected rent on time because tenants had figured out how to manage basic responsibilities. I wanted to be one of those normal people again. Not the person who'd lost everything gambling. Not the dealer who'd become the cautionary tale she used to observe, but someone who paid rent on time and helped her mother with medical bills and fixed her car when it needed fixing. The path back to normal felt impossibly long, but it started with choosing to take it. Choosing recovery over more gambling. Choosing honesty over more lies. Choosing to rebuild rather than trying to get even. I set my alarm for my next shift and tried to sleep, not planning my next bet, but planning my next step toward becoming someone I could respect again. Tomorrow I'd figure out how to come up with $600 legally. Tonight, I'd sleep knowing that Marcus had found a way out, that my mother was getting the help she needed, and that I still had a job dealing cards to people who might or might not learn from their mistakes the way I was trying to learn from mine. The certainty I'd felt as a gambling expert was gone, but something steadier was taking its place. The knowledge that recovery was possible, even if it wasn't easy, and that the only bet worth making was on my own ability to change.